make sure that's started. Hello, I'm François Gay, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Cybersecurity Network. I'm excited to kick off this webinar that's being sponsored by Arctic Wolf. And this subject, cybersecurity insurance, is a critical one to our industry right now. It is a really hot subject. A lot of companies don't know too much about cybersecurity insurance, if they can afford it, if it's going to be available in the future. And we've got the experts for all of you to find out a little bit more about it. So please take advantage of this session. I'm going to hand it over to David. David Senf is our moderator, and David will work with our panelists and share a lot of great information. David?
Well, thanks. Thank you very much, Francois. I definitely appreciate it. I appreciate the invite from the Canadian Cybersecurity Network. Also appreciate, by the way, all the work you do, Francois, with the community and building out this Canadian Cybersecurity Network. So great job there. I'm glad you're hosting this today. Thanks to Arctic Wolf as well for helping to pull this together. And so, as you're saying, the cyber insurance industry, it can really seem complex, and there's been a lot of change over the last little while. So what we want to do is really help simplify the conversation. I think elevate it in some ways as well, right? And today's session really is about you. So ask your questions, put them into the Q&A. If, as Francois was saying, if you're in the lobby, come join us. We're friendly, the waters are warm here, and you can use the Q&A. You can chat amongst each other using the chat function, but if you have questions, do feel free to use the Q&A function. Makes it much easier for us to manage that at the end of the day. But as you ask your questions as we go, if you do that, we'll certainly be sure to get to it. We might have a couple minutes at the end to be able to get to questions, but I would encourage you to get your questions in as we go. So for me, I know I've been having a lot of conversations with customers that increasingly involve some aspect of cyber insurance where they're saying, hey, are you seeing the rates increase? And there seems to be more requirements to qualify, and which attacks are covered, and how much coverage do I actually need? What is, there's a lot of questions that are out there. And so today we'll look at those questions, but I think we'll also take the conversation forward a little bit, because we want to think about how does the insurer get involved with detection and response and ultimately to recovery as well. So there's a lot of questions, and we've got the panel here to give us the answers. I'm really excited about the group that's been assembled. And so first we've got Christopher Fielder. He's the field CTO at Arctic Wolf, former security operations at the CIA, US Air Force, and a SANS expert as well. Been on panels with him before, and a panel, and just really enjoyed his insights. Christopher, welcome to the panel.
Thank you so much, David. I appreciate it. Let me go ahead and start off by apologizing because I'm in southwestern Virginia, where we're already getting some pollen. So I'm getting hit with allergies early in the season. So if my voice cracks at all, forgive me for that. But appreciate you asking me to join. This is great.
These sound great. So next, we've also got Dan Elliott. He's principal cybersecurity risk consulting at Zurich. So he's former CSIS. So we've got CSIS and CIA. I'm not sure if I should be really afraid here, if I should feel really safe. I guess we'll know by the end of the conversation. And also intelligence officer and one of the leaders over at CBSA as well. So lots of good history there. So welcome to the panel, Dan.
Thank you very much. Really happy to be here. Happy to participate.
Thank you. And Jonathan Weeks, Senior Vice President, Cyber Practice Leader at Hub International, with a long history in the insurance industry with Marsh, AIG, AON. And so going to be leaning on you a fair bit today, Jonathan, in terms of some of the expertise and the history that you've got in the industry, and help us walk us through some of what's happening. So welcome to the panel as well, Jonathan.
Thank you. Excited to be here. Looking forward to demystifying a lot of the rumors and maybe fables in and around the cyber insurance industry. Happy to be here.
We definitely appreciate that. And seeing as you're offering, then I'll take you up on it. So as a broker with Hub Insurance, with Hub International, you work with the end customer, right? So can you start us off and really just help us understand a little bit more about the ecosystem? There's a lot of different players, a carrier, underwriter, agent, broker. There's also, the security service provider will be getting there as well. But can you maybe distill it a little bit and help us understand the roles and a bit more about the ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, there's a grouping of people who are involved through the cyber insurance process. Traditionally, there have been three roles: that of the broker, the underwriter, and the claims person. The broker's responsibility ultimately is to the client. So it's our responsibility to educate the client in and around cyber risks and insurance to ensure that the products that they're purchasing actually meet the needs and their expectations from a coverage perspective. Next, you have the underwriter. The underwriter's responsibility is really to assess risk presented to them by a broker and a client and determine an appropriate rate to apply to that risk. So they're the ones who are really pricing it out. So despite people getting really, really angry at their brokers over the past 2 years, we should be blaming the underwriters. But they have good reasons to look at risk in the way that they do. And the underwriter's responsibility is to the insurance company. So they're there to not only assess that risk, but also protect the insurance company's interest in deploying their capacity out to clients. And then traditionally you have the claims adjuster. So when a client actually has a cybersecurity incident and they submit a claim to an insurer, the claims adjuster is the one who essentially pays out the claim ultimately, but it's also the responsibility to make sure that the contract in terms of that insurance policy is upheld to the legal language within it. And most recently, outside of those three traditional roles, we have people like Dan. So a lot of brokers and insurers are now actually employing cybersecurity consultants to sit on staff and advise clients or underwriters on how they should be looking at a risk and how to best address it from one end or the other.
Well, seeing as Jonathan teed you up, Dan, what do you think? What would you add to? That was, by the way, great description. Thank you. That clarified some of the points for me as well. So, what would you add to that as well, Dan?
No, and Jonathan hit a lot of the things on the head. I mean, when I came on board in the fall of last year, really my run-up has been on both sides. So on one side, it's helping the underwriters assess risk to be able to get a risk score and better understand the vulnerabilities and the challenges that organization will hold, because that underwriter has to be an expert in the insurance industry. It's also very difficult to then at the same time hold the same level of expertise within cybersecurity. So I assist them in that stead, and then at the same time, I work with some of the clients to be able to build a roadmap, develop themselves, become more resilient, because it's one thing to have that one touch point and go, this is the snapshot of where I sit today, but it's an evolving situation. There are evolving threats and evolving opportunities that they need to really continue to build. And that's where they leverage experts like those in my area that see both sides of that coin.
Okay, I'm excited. There's definitely some threads I want to pull on in terms of some of the areas that you've been leaning into a bit, Dan, in terms of like how risk is calculated and that kind of thing. And we'll come back to that in just a couple minutes. I'm really looking forward to your responses there. Christopher, from your standpoint, so there's the security service providers like Arctic Wolf, and you factor into the equation as well. So you're going to be working in some cases with the insurer, in some cases just trying to ensure that the customer is positioned in the best possible light. So can you give us a sense for how you fit into the equation from an Arctic Wolf standpoint?
Yeah, we fit in multiple ways. I'm going to speak just from the Arctic Wolf standpoint, because we have what we call the concierge approach, which is very much allows us to ask the question, what do you need, right? And we could ask that of both the insurance provider, but we could also ask it for the customer. In some cases, we're in the customer environment before they even have insurance, and they can ask us things like, do we need insurance? And our answer is yes. And how can we help you, do that, facilitate that? We can also help them meet the requirements they usually need for, they have to have 24/7, 365 coverage, or what is the insurance provider requesting for them to have to be insurable, right? So we have to make sure that they are insurable. And then we can help insurance companies if we have an incident response arm where we can come in. If somebody, is hit, we can cover the insurance company on that side and make sure that we identify what the breach is, and make sure that we get the customer to a better spot. So we can really fit in multiple positions and also act as another layer of expertise.
Oh, that's excellent. That definitely helps to understand how it fits together. And we'll be definitely coming back there to unpack that a little bit in terms of some of the detection, response, and recovery capabilities as well, just to get a flavor for how all that fits together. And so, so Jonathan, let's think about coverage for a minute. And so there was the Arctic Wolf team. They did a survey that actually has a Canadian sample as well as worldwide. One of the stats that I saw from there was the expectations of cyber insurance coverage, and about half of the respondents said that we believe that the insurer will cover 100% associated with a breach, and the rest of the respondents were pretty close to that. How does that sound to you? Does that sound about right? So we'll get specifically into coverage, but I was curious what you thought about that overall in terms of
I'm not surprised to see that. And generally, my experience is that most clients take a very reasonable approach to cyber insurance and their expectations, because they're also insurance buyers and for other exposures like property, casualty, so on and so forth. I think the key point that we need to make sure is understood is that cyber insurance is intended to cover off costs associated with any given breach or security incident. So it's not cost to pay for things that really should have been in place to begin with. It's not intended to put you in a better position. It's intended to indemnify you and put you whole after you experience an incident. So I'm not surprised to see those stats, actually.
Interesting. Okay, can we go a little further then in terms of, so there's different kinds of events. There's the disruptive, like DDoS type of event that hits me in terms of availability, or ransomware in terms of integrity. So there's that disruptive type of event. And then separately, there's a breach of confidentiality. So person identifiable information gets exposed. So in terms of those different kinds of exposures, what does coverage look like in terms of, and what should those conversations start to look like with a customer around differentiating between the different types of disruptions?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the best way to answer it is that cyber insurance policies cover off both ends of that. So privacy related matters, as well as operational matters like operational disruption, for example. So if you look at the core coverage under a cyber policy, it's usually divided up into two different sections. You have your first party costs, which are more out-of-pocket expenses, and then you have your third party costs, which are more so liability, which most people are most familiar with when it comes to cyber insurance. So if we dig in a little bit on the third party costs first, it's generally the place where you don't want to land if you ever have a security incident, because that's when people are taking legal action against you, or you're experiencing some sort of regulatory action, investigation, fines and penalties, so on and so forth. So cyber insurance policies will cover you off for any liability associated with an event, so if there's legal action taken, but it'll also pay to defend you throughout that suit. So it'll pay for defense costs and liability arising out of a security or a privacy related matter. The first party cost, which is really where the insurance industry has been hit over the past several years, are more out-of-pocket expenses or out-of-pocket impacts to a given client. So if we look at, for example, a ransomware incident, insurance policies will not only cover off the initial incident response, so bringing in a firm to contain that breach and negotiate with threat actors in terms of what is considered a reasonable ransom, if any ransom is considered reasonable, but the insurance policy can actually also pay out the ransom itself if that's the path that the client chooses to take. But it'll also respond to indemnify the client for any loss of income or extra expense incurred as a result of that network outage or unavailability. So the policies are quite broad. And then if there's privacy implications, the policy is also going to step in to provide notification costs to impacted individuals, things like credit monitoring costs where appropriate and for an appropriate length of time. And then if there's damage to data systems, so on and so forth, those are also claimable under insurance policies. So they're quite broad, probably too much so, which is why the insurance industry has been in a bit of a tough spot over the past couple of years. It's because the policies have actually been responding really effectively to make clients whole subsequent to a cyber-related incident.
It's interesting. I saw a stat recently, I think it was from research from IDC, that was saying about half of the time in Canada that organizations are paying the ransom. it was just easier for them to be able to recover that way, as opposed to having had the mitigating controls or other controls in place in the first place that would have prevented that from happening. But in any case, not sure if you see that. So, but it's good to hear that, that from that perspective, you guys are really helping to cover that off and walk them through that whole process. That's excellent.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Dan, I want to come back to you. So you started to talk a little bit about risk. And I know it's really difficult to calculate and to quantify risk from a cybersecurity standpoint. There's really just many variables and there's constant change. So can you take us behind the scenes and help us understand a little bit more about how risk is calculated? And you can take a little bit of time for this, because it's really the essence on which the foundation on which the other elements are based. So be very curious to hear how you articulate this.
For sure, David. And I wish it were as easy a calculation as some of the areas of insurance that we have, 100-year history of. We have the stats to run, a longer runtime. So, to Jonathan's point, it's one of those situations where we're having to take into account that accumulation of risk throughout the organization, throughout the industry. I mean, when I get involved, I start by looking at an organization's crown jewels and then looking at vulnerability rings out from there. And the typical measurement that is used in by a lot of insurers, a lot of risk experts, is really an issue of controls assessment. So measuring them up against the NIST framework, going through the typical controls questionnaire to look at what their risk mitigation is in place, to see not only what tools they've got and that they're using and set up properly and configured properly, how their people are in place, making sure that the right people are in the right positions, there's enough of them, and they're trained, and everybody else has some idea of what to do in a situation, and then looking at how those two interact. So, whether that's policies, procedures, processes, whether automated or not, and you kind of build out, you start with that picture. So I start with, as everybody who's ever applied for cyber insurance is aware, there starts with the questionnaire. And typically the brokers have built their questionnaire list based on, their own knowledge in that space and the various insurers and what people are looking for. And that questionnaire list comes into me. I start to do an assessment generally of where they sit against a NIST maturity model to see, where they are in their industry and their vertical against, typical, what we'd see as typical scoring on a NIST framework. And then we look at, individually as a group of risk specialists, we look at the threat actors we're seeing, where the threat actors tend to be looking, where those vulnerabilities tend to be exploited. And there is some quantification and qualification of it to kind of, I wish it's not as random as, a finger in the wind, but it's not as perfect as calculated math. You have to play somewhere in the middle where you can assess the likelihood, because as we know, cybersecurity is something that is not a perfect system. Somebody can have the right controls in place, and if a threat actor of significant skill and significant resources wants to specifically get in, we can't say beyond a shadow of a doubt there isn't a way to get it. And that's why, risk mitigation is a piece of it, but also cyber resilience is an important piece of it, that if something were to happen, how quickly can this organization get back up? Because to Jonathan's point, a piece of that coverage is in that business interruption. And part of my advice when I'm giving advice either to clients or to the underwriter, because they're both balancing the same notion, what's the likelihood that this organization is going to get hit? And if they're hit, where's that likely to happen? And then how long is it likely to take them to get back up? And those are the conversations I have, whether it's, with a client working with them directly or with the underwriter when they're making their assessment for risk.
Really interesting. And so it's fascinating to hear that you're quantifying on both the side of the organization themselves. So, what controls do they have in place and what's their maturity level? but also from a threat actor standpoint. So it's not just like, hey, it's a CVSS score, but it's is this actually being attacked, and is this type of organization, likely to be attacked by this type of actor? That's very interesting to hear, and it just multiplies or exponentially builds on the complexity of your job. So I'm amazed you have time to be on the panel, but that's
one of the highlights.
yeah. Well, thank you for that. So out of curiosity, so you use the NIST cybersecurity framework. It sounded like a fair bit there. Will you also look at like CIS 18 controls and stuff like that? Like if a customer follows that, or how do you tend to look at that in terms of different frameworks?
So for us, when we're doing the assessment, in order to compare apples to apples across all of our different client verticals, we choose to apply a NIST assessment to them. I deal with clients who use, use CIS, use ASD, use the NCSS, use all these different guidance points and frameworks in order to judge based on where they are globally and what standard they're applying. They differ in the way in which they apply things, but not the recommendations that they're making. So from my standpoint, if an organization is following a process and a standard in order to apply controls in a thoughtful way, it is likely less relevant which one they're following and more relevant that they are applying one thoughtfully and continuing to find ways to adapt and mature themselves.
Very interesting. I think about it today, and most of the customers you talk to, it's like you have a sense for, that attacker's going to get initial access. So now it's about what's their ability to limit lateral movement, discovery, privilege escalation, and ultimately persistence within that organization. And to that point, I want to bring Christopher back into the conversation as well. And so when you're thinking about, what you've just heard from Jonathan and what you've heard from Dan as well, and trying to, again, work with the customer to make sure the controls are in place that give them the best possible position they can be in vis-a-vis insurance, but also just to be safe out there. How are those conversations going? Which controls are you advising, and where do you see some weaknesses as well that you tend to try and help shore up with organizations?
It's a great question. So I've been sitting here quietly on mute because I was listening, right? I love joining these things, not only because it gets me out of meetings, but also because I learn a lot as well. So one thing I want to circle back to is I heard Jonathan say something that kind of opened my eyes, and that was this, the expectations of what customers are paying. And he said, we cover for what they have, not what they want, really, right? And that's going to allow me to speak to customers a lot more about that, kind of set the right expectations. That idea of, if I've got an 89 Civic that's sitting in the driveway and it gets dented, I can't say, well, now I want a Maserati, right? And they'll pay just enough to get the Civic back on the road. And speaking about that Civic, it's a really nice car. So I have to think about like what I'm going to do with the risk when it comes to that. And just living life and, going into business, there's risk that's going to be involved. Every day we have to assume risk, and we have to be very careful with what risk we're actually going to accept and how we're going to handle this risk. And when we are talking to customers about risk, we want to make sure that they're only taking on the risk that is really necessary. So we can help customers a lot with that. The top 5 CIS controls, you mentioned CIS, and we want to make sure that they are meeting those. We found that just if they follow the top 5 CIS controls, they can actually minimize their risk by over 90%, which is very significant. And most of those top 5 CIS controls really come down to visibility and control and understanding, well, what do I have in my environment? What systems do I have? What software do I have? What vulnerabilities do I have? Because if they don't see that, they don't understand that, then they're going to take way more risk on. If I put that Civic on the road and I can't see through the windshield, I can't see who else is on the road, I don't know what the weather's going to be like, I'm taking way more risk than if I know those things. If I do know, what systems I have, which ones have vulnerabilities on them, I can put more visibility around that. Who's on my environment and, what type of privilege do they have? I can take a lot less risk because I can monitor that a lot closer. So we like to help customers with that. We use the NIST framework as well. We'll use really whatever a customer wants and utilizes, but we also like to follow those top 5 CIS controls.
By the way, Jim is taking issue with your issue with a dented 89 Civic. It's a strong, dependable car, he asserts.
It
So
is.
thanks, Jim, for
It
that.
was. I bring that up because it was my first car.
That's excellent. By the way, I just like Dan, I also prefer with customers to walk through the NIST cybersecurity framework. I also like the matrix, the cyber defense matrix that Sunil Yu put together. There's a lot of reading and YouTube videos he's put out on it. It's kind of this very simplistic 5x5 matrix you can look at. It's got the NIST cybersecurity framework along the top, the areas that I'm trying to defend along the side, devices, application, network, data, and users. And so by using that, you can start to kind of get a sense for where some of your gaps are. Maybe it's a bit too simple in some ways, but might be a good place to get started. So great advice there, Christopher. Very much appreciate that. And we've got another question that's actually super well timed. So the question is, what's an average premium for a mid-sized company in Canada? They're talking about, like a 1,000 seat type of company. And I'm going to pause on that and ask it this way, because I know that's an it depends question. I'm going to throw this over to Jonathan. And that's basically, how much insurance do I buy? And can you help us kind of contextualize this a little bit? Because what the person didn't indicate in their question is, are they finance? Are they manufacturing? Are they retail? And I assume it's going to be a little different just based on some of the things that Dan was saying as well, based on those different organizations. So you can give us a flavor for how much should I buy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I generally don't comment on pricing on these types of webinars just because it puts me in a very dangerous position. But when we look at how much cyber insurance protection you should buy, we have to go back to the principle of insurance and risk transfer to begin with, and the fact that as an organization, it's your job and responsibility to address inherent risk and then transfer out that residual risk if that's the proper or the right pathway forward for you. In terms of how much to buy, it really depends on the size of the organization, the industry. I think the first thing an organization should do is determine the level of risk associated with both privacy and security exposures, determine how much of that financial risk they're prepared to retain as an organization, and then determine the level of risk to transfer out to insurance. There's no magic number because every organization has a different level of comfort with retaining risk. And it should really be an exercise that's performed across many stakeholders internally, because whether it's a privacy or a security related event or a combination of both, it'll have a different impact depending on where you're sitting in an organization. So the CFO might have very different concerns from the CISO within the organization as to what happens in the event of a cyber attack. From industry to industry, that's where we also see changes in where you should be focusing your attention from an actual policy language perspective. So if you're a manufacturer or someone who needs just-in-time availability of your network and you're highly dependent on your network being operational, you might focus a lot more of your attention on that business interruption coverage under your policy, making sure that that's as broad as possible. But if you're a financial institution or, for example, higher education, you might focus a lot more of your attention on quantifying or determining the right amount of risk to transfer associated with your privacy exposures. So a breach of confidential or private information. And your broker can help you with this. There's a few different tools that we can use internally. The good thing about the insurance industry is we do a really good job of tracking data. So it also allows us to use that data to help our client make educated decisions when they go out to purchase cyber insurance. And every broker uses different methods and tools in order to do that, but it's generally available through your insurance broker or some other form of risk consultancy.
Interesting. So I guess it's kind of an unfair question to ask if there's benchmarks, because I think like of finger in the wind benchmarks. So remember there was one we used to say in cybersecurity, the budget should be roughly like 10% of your IT budget, and that's actually been creeping up over time. Is there? It sounds by the way you're describing it, you couldn't really give a X percent of that, of revenue or what have you. But are there benchmarks, or am I?
Yeah. The good thing is, like I mentioned, most brokers actually track how much their clients buy, and it's usually divided up by industry, size of client, so on and so forth. So we have the ability to pull up comparative peers within a given peer group and advise the client, look, this is what your peers are buying. If you need a bit of a benchmark to determine what might be appropriate for you. However, as an organization, it's your job to make sure that the risk you're transferring out is in line with your priorities as an organization. So we generally don't tell clients what to buy. We'll help them get to the point where they can make an educated decision on what limit is appropriate to purchase and what retention or deductible under the policy is also appropriate.
Got it. Okay, so we've been covering off a lot already. We've talked about the overall ecosystem and learned a little bit more about how all those pieces start to fit together and what the different roles are. We'll continue to expand on that as we go. We've learned about risk and a little bit around how risk is starting to get calculated. We've also started to look at coverage. What I want to do now is drill into some of those areas a little bit deeper by doing it this way. So, we can think about once the proverbial stuff hits the fan, what happens next? And so I want to think about this in three areas: in detection, response, and recovery as well. And so from a detection standpoint, Jonathan, so I've detected something has happened. Maybe I'm not even quite sure how bad the situation is. So when is the cyber insurer contacted, and what are kind of the first few steps that you're going to start to take with the customer just at that detection point? Then we'll get into response and recovery as well.
Yeah, for sure. So under most cyber insurance policies, the language in and around notice to your insurer will always say as soon as practicable.
Okay.
So they don't expect someone to see something on their computer and then they pick up the phone and they call the cyber insurance company, because then it causes a lot of traffic that's maybe not needed. So my recommendation to clients is investigate internally, determine the likelihood or the probability of this actually being a significant impact to your organization, and then engage your cyber insurer at that point. I do think it is important to engage your cyber insurance company early in the process before you start incurring significant costs. So we usually see it going one of two ways. A client has actually included cyber insurance within their incident response plan, so it's very, very clear as to when and how to engage, or they haven't, and everyone is scrambling, not quite sure who to call and where and when to call. Insurers usually have two intake methods. We have insurers who have their own in-house incident response teams who can actually support clients through the initial phases. And then you have others who have a panel of vendors that ensures that their clients, however, rather can actually engage with in order to start that incident response process.
That's perfect. By the way, I've just noticed there are some questions in the chat as well, and we will definitely circle back to those because there's some good ones that we can certainly come back to fill in some of the comments that that folk were looking for. No, that's helpful. And so is there, I guess significant again is one of those things. It's, well, significant is, it's a bread box, it's a Winnebago. Yeah. Right? I guess it depends.
Yeah, I mean, something to consider is usually within an incident response plan, you have levels of criticality in terms of specific incidents or types of incidents you might encounter. So we usually encourage clients to, within their incident response plan, determine the appropriate level of panic, I'll call it, at which point you're engaging your cyber insurance company. So if you operate on like a yellow, green, red, or green, yellow, red, I guess I'll go in order. If you're in the green, some clients say, you know what, we can handle this internally. It's unlikely to result in a material incident. There's no need to contact the cyber insurer at this point. If it gets worse, we'll contact. And then at that yellow, they'll say, you know what, let's just put them on notice, letting them know that we're working on something. There might be something going on. And then if it's like alarm bells going off in that red area, just call. And that'll vary from client to client. But generally, it should be tied in some way, somehow into your incident response plan and aligned again with how you identify and classify risk from a cyber and a privacy perspective.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so unfortunately, we've decided that it is significant. So I have picked up the phone. I've called you. So what actions do you start to assist with during the response phase? And Dan and Chris will can weigh in on this as well. who will be contacted? Because I'm thinking legal, communication, security, incident response, crisis management. Like there's a lot of people who I may very well need to bring into this. So how does that all happen? Who does the calling around to bring all those pieces together? Hopefully that's already been done in a plan. But in any case, can you walk us through a bit of the steps on response? And then I'll go to Christopher as well, because I know Wolf and what you guys do is a key part of that too.
Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned, there's a few different methods that you can go about. Some insurance companies have a 24/7 incident response team internally that you can call. They'll go through the initial stages of that investigation with you to determine what the issue might actually be if you haven't been able to do that yourself. And in some cases, they're actually able to remediate that for you. So that's one style of doing things. The other method, which is more common in the insurance industry, is where a carrier will have a panel of pre-approved vendors and law firms that you can engage with, pending that insurance company getting back to you after you call their, usually a hotline, to advise them that there's a breach. Realistically, you're the broker. If the client has included cyber insurance in that incident response plan, they're going to call their broker first. So I'm usually the one up on like a Saturday morning at 10 a.m. taking calls from clients, letting me know that something has occurred. And then sometimes the broker acts as that quarterback. If they have a good relationship and they've clearly identified a breach coach, usually a privacy lawyer that they would engage with in the event of a breach, sometimes it's a privacy lawyer that's the first point of contact, and they'll act as a quarterback, engaging with whatever vendors necessary. Usually, even if you call your broker, our recommendation is that you get in contact with a breach coach as soon as possible.
Interesting. I'm just out of curiosity. So when people are calling you at 10 a.m. on a Saturday, and I feel bad for your family, to be honest, but they're calling on a Saturday morning, have you noticed that have the conversations changed over time? Like, are they getting more, less hairs on fire type of conversation, a little bit more, okay, we're calmer, I understand these things happen, or is it still, oh my gosh, I really need some desperate help here? Just kind of curious. Yeah.
Overall, and I'd love to hear Chris and Christopher and Dan's opinions on this as well, but I think overall it's a little bit more of a calm, level-headed approach to things now, provided they've done the work in advance. Yeah. I think years and years ago, if something was to occur, they just target whoever's in charge of information security, and they just grill the person like there's no tomorrow. But now that more organizations are taking a holistic approach where all stakeholders are involved with identifying and sort of addressing cyber risk, they'll come together as a group and determine the next steps. So it's a little less finger pointing, it's a little less panic. And because the insurance industry has pushed people so hard to put together incident response plans and test them, I find that clients are a lot more prepared now. But Dan, Christopher, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the key point that Jonathan made there was for the organizations that have done some work in advance. It's one of those ounce of preparation type of deals that I've seen people print off government incident response plans and then just paste their own corporate name at the top and think that, well, I've got an IRP, I'm ready to go. It's really about having an incident response plan that is fit for purpose, that you've tested, so that people are not hair on fire in the moment. And organizations that are in that stead, we come in a lot during their their recovery phase to kind of help them build back through. And I find those organizations are the ones that say, yeah, it happened, we missed something, or there was a gap. It was either part of our roadmap, or we hadn't gotten to it yet, or we didn't know about it, but they were able to deal with the incident at that moment without extreme panic. And you can tell in the rest of the C-suite that they had confidence in the way that IT leadership was moving. And there are still some where, if they haven't done their homework, if they haven't done any preparation, if they don't know, to Christopher's point, if they don't know what their assets are and what their vulnerabilities are, yeah, that's a bit of a panic. If you don't know where your front door is, or if it's locked, and you hear someone in your house, you have a lot more panic than if you have an idea of how they could have got in. And I think that Jonathan's strong point is those who've prepared in advance.
I think, unfortunately, a lot of organizations are becoming numb to being breached in an unfortunate way, right? We recently did some research at Arctic Wolf where we talked to 700 organizations globally, and we found that 50% of them in the last 12 months were breached. 43% suffered ransomware. And put that in context of, okay, if every other house on your block has caught fire, then when your house catches fire, you're going to pick up the phone and go, yeah, we're on fire too here. Yeah, it's my turn. You're just going to get numb to it, unfortunately, and it's not going to be the catastrophic event that it once was. And that's the unfortunate situation I think we're in. And I'm really hoping that is reduced, but I don't think that's going to be the situation. I think we're just all going to start to live with these breaches.
So, and then in terms of the role from a response standpoint, from a service provider, I mean, you guys are in there pretty quickly. So it's and plus you've got different ways. You've got the and providers more broadly. You can do it as a managed service, but then on top of that, there's the incident response capabilities to contain the attack, but also to ensure that the attacker, we're starting to get them out of the environment. You guys certainly have been building out that practice for some time. So do you want to give us a sense for how that sort of fits into the equation on the response side as well?
Sure. So there's a couple ways that we can initiate incident response. If they are an existing customer of ours and they have managed detection and response, they can get something called an incident response retainer that says, okay, if the stuff hits the fan, which hopefully it doesn't because we're monitored 24/7, 365, we're right there. Activate the retainer and we immediately go into an incident response scenario. What's much more common for our Arctic Wolf incident response division is they will be contacted by an insurance provider, like David kind of alluded to, that will then come in and say, okay, hey, we have a client, that we have a policyholder that was compromised. Unfortunately, we need an incident response team on site or remotely, and then we can initiate incident response that way and make sure we get things cleaned up. And when it comes to incident response, there's some advice that I would give here, if it's okay, real quick. And that's, the way that incident response generally unfolds is it follows the process that we call pickerel. Some of you might have heard that before, but it is preparation, identification, containment, eradication, recovery, and lessons learned, right? That's kind of the full process there. And it's about, okay, preparing for the incident, identifying, scoping it out, containing it to make sure it doesn't go any further, eradicating it, and then recovering and getting business continuity running again, and then doing lessons learned. And people ask me, what is the most important one there? And I say the most important one that's often overlooked is lessons learned. Because you get to the point where you say, okay, recovery, you get business continuity going again, you're making money once again, everyone's kind of taking a sigh of relief, that you won't go into lessons learned. And when it comes to the standpoint of both insurance and customers, lessons learned is so important because it prevents it from occurring again. How did this happen? How do we stop it from happening again? How do we actually, prevent these type of situations from occurring? The customer needs to know lessons learned because they need to go to their insurance provider and say, this is what happened, and this is why we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. So please don't drop our policy. Please keep us on as a customer. Please don't raise our rates, unfortunately. And the insurance providers need to know lessons learned because they need to go back and say, okay, here's what happened to this client. Unfortunately, we had to cover some of those costs, but now we want to make sure that other customers aren't affected by this. So what do we put in place to make sure that others don't suffer the same situation? So I would say, following all those processes are really important, but please make sure you take the time 24 to 48 hours after an incident, sit down, get every stakeholder involved and say, what did we learn? How are we going to stop this from happening again?
Yeah, that nicely leads us into recovery. So we've talked about detection, we've talked a little bit about the response side, and obviously we could do quite a number of webinars just on either one of those, but certainly on the response side, there's a lot of work to do. The recovery side, once I've got to clean up the mess, essentially. And get things back up to business as usual. I believe that I've got the attacker out of the environment. I'm starting to try and recover. So you definitely, to your point, Christopher, want to be doing lessons learned. What did I learn throughout this? What can we apply going forward? What are some of the other things that I want to think about, Jonathan, from your standpoint, as you're helping customers through that recovery phase?
Yeah. I think this is a phase of the process that's most important to communicate with your broker and your insurance company. because it likely will have the biggest impact on how your coverage responds. Under insurance policies, and we talked a little bit earlier about expectations around how or what is covered. Everything is covered subject to the four corners of that insurance contract. And I think clients do need to take time to read that contract to ensure it's clear, or to ensure they are clear on what's covered. There are a lot of costs and expenses under as you navigate through the recovery of a breach that require the prior approval of your insurance company. So a few things that I think clients should keep in mind: if we're looking at business interruption or income loss, track things like employee overtime, track additional hours being put in or additional expenses that you're incurring as you recover from that breach, and have those pre-approved, or show a statement of work to your carrier and have them approve it before you pay. And the reason for that is because they require prior approval of the insurer, if you incur those costs, it's going to take you a lot longer at the tail end to negotiate the payment of those things if you haven't involved your insurance company throughout that whole process. The other thing I would consider is some policies include some element of betterment in terms of improving your environment subsequent to a cyber attack. Some insurers voluntarily provide that coverage. It's usually not up to the full limit of liability under the policy, but don't incur costs to improve your current posture without the prior approval of an insurer. Because just a reminder, the intent of insurance is to indemnify you and make you whole, put you in the same position you were in prior to a breach. It's not to apply the budget that you weren't willing to apply prior to a breach in order to help you recover and be in a better state subsequent to it. So just, I think communication is sort of what I'll leave with that. Generally, it's all handled by third-party vendors, people like Christopher and his friends, sorry. And I think just communicate clearly and constantly with your insurer to make sure that you're not left disappointed or misguided in terms of what you thought would have been paid out.
In terms of, and thank you for that. So in terms of exclusions, so one of the ones that's been bandied about in the media was around war and some of the nation state sponsored types of attacks. How is that going overall? Are those if it's determined that it was, APT 29 out of Russia or what have you, that, as opposed to, one of the financially motivated attackers, would that make a difference, or is that not going to make a difference?
Yeah, I think it depends on the scenario. And just to make a quick statement that people can take back and review as they see fit, the war exclusions under these policies are generally untested. So it's difficult to say how the policy will respond in fact if we've largely been unable to assess the potential impact of cyber war on cyber insurance. What I will say is that there are implications if you look at things like sanctions. So as a result of sanctions, there's certain elements of coverage where, for example, paying a ransom, you cannot pay a ransom into a sanctioned country or to a sanctioned group and not face the backlash or the fines and penalties associated with doing that. Generally, the incident response firm engaged will do a sanctions check to ensure that if that ransom is being paid, it's not going to a group that will land the client in hot water. But with respect to cyber war and the war exclusions and the terrorism exclusions, it's very, very difficult to determine because it's untested how those will respond. Generally, in cyber insurance policies, there's no specific language saying that if it's a state-sponsored group, that coverage does not apply. So that's probably the safest way I can answer that question.
No, that's fair, and I appreciate that response for sure. And so I do want to circle back to Ivan's question. Ivan, thanks for waiting in there. It's kind of, Dan, coming back to just calculating risk before we go into some of our closing comments here as well. So the question was basically, do you use any risk monitoring tools? And he's enumerated some of those, like attack surface monitoring, data breach monitoring, social and public exposure monitoring, third-party risk monitoring. Obviously, there's a lot of different solutions that an organization could put in place, and also that a cyber insurer could put in place. And you could work with a provider and that kind of thing. So how does that look? Do you use tools like that in the calculations?
So we do use some, and it makes up a portion of that assessment. So there isn't, a nice way to say it, I guess, is there is not, a single tool or a single assessment that we apply to say, okay, this is the score, this is exactly where they sit. So yes, the outside in scans, essentially what they're doing, or the IP scans that are being done, it provides a window into some vulnerabilities, and it may provide conversational points to have to understand why, but you know, we layer some of them on top of each other to build on that picture, but it becomes a tool in the toolbox rather than, you know, a panacea of our risk score or for our risk score.
Excellent. Okay, no, that's helpful in terms of understanding what gets used in that process. So thanks for the question, Ivan. As we go to the closing few minutes, do feel free to add your questions in as well. We'll do our best to get to that. So I'll put this one of the last questions in this frame, and that is, if I wanted to, you can look at it either way. If I want to reduce my rates, the positive side to that as well is I want to improve security overall. So you've all given some really good ways and examples of the direction that organizations need to take to A, be more secure, and B, to impact positively what they're going to be paying in terms of cyber insurance and what the coverage ultimately is going to be and that kind of thing. So Dan, from your perspective, anything else you wanted to add in terms of ways that organizations can think about how do I get that lower rate? And of course, hopefully that aligns with them being more secure, and I think it will. So,
for sure, I think there are two sides to that, and it's been touched upon throughout the conversation this hour. The first one is communication with your broker, with your insurer, to understand, you know, where they see your vulnerabilities and risks, and where the vulnerabilities are that maybe they're concerned with. You know, some clients we see once a year when their renewal is up, and we have to do a full assessment then. Some engage with us throughout the year, and we can get a better understanding of what their plan is, what their vulnerabilities are, and where we agree or disagree on how those vulnerabilities are likely to impact them. And then more broadly is have a plan. I mean, I've seen people throw an alphabet soup at the wall and say, well, I've got this and I've got that and I've got this, and you know, I'm sure it's configured or it's sitting in a closet. But the reality is you want to have a plan, you know, start with what your crown jewels are, build out based on the vulnerabilities there, what are your stakeholders most concerned about, and then build out those tools and that training and everything else in a thoughtful way rather than just throwing tools and money at it, because there is a reason. And when we come in to have those conversations, we want to understand why you've applied certain tools or why you haven't applied certain tools and what the compensating controls are. Because there may be reasons why you haven't done something, but that's as important as the checkbox of yes or no.
really good advice, especially because as we get stronger legislation in Canada that's coming to us from essentially global legislation that Canada is now emulating, whether it's from the privacy side or from the cybersecurity side in C26 or enhancements to the Digital Privacy Act. Doing what Dan is saying there will also help you keep you out of the crosshairs of that. And so if something does happen and you're working with the privacy commissioner's office or what have you, you're going to be in a much better position to be able to defend yourself as well there. So planning absolutely is a critical element to this. Christopher, from your standpoint, just being able to, I know you've given us a lot of great advice. Any kind of final thoughts in terms of areas where you want to have customers direct their focus to be able to ensure that they're a little bit more secure?
Yeah, so, protecting your virtual environment is not that different from a foundational standpoint than protecting a physical environment that's existed across time and cultures. And that's, understanding what it is you're trying to protect, like looking at everything, getting a full grasp of what it is that you're trying to maintain there, right? And then monitoring it closely, like putting the legwork in. And I love what Dan said about, the alphabet soup. And it's really easy to think that you're going to find the silver bullet that they've demoed for you. And, you're going to get this new piece of technology. and throw it against the wall and hope that, okay, well, this is going to protect my environment. But it's really cool to have those new widgets and play with them. But from a foundational standpoint, the same things are always going to work. So try not to get caught up in that idea of, okay, I'm going to purchase the new piece of technology, because your insurance provider may not know how to quantify that yet either. So you may spend the money on that and they're going to go, that's not proven. I don't know how that's going to help. I can't really use that to factor in any kind of rate reduction. So it may not help you on that front. So, anything that's going to protect your environment from that foundational standpoint is also going to help, I would say, in my experience, reduced rates as well, because they're going to understand how to quantify that. And then I'll just quickly kind of hit on here real quick. Arctic Wolf has previously done research into the cyber insurance area, and I'll admit we have learned a lot, because we tried to look at it from the standpoint of, well, what is going on from cyber insurance globally? And what we found is that was kind of a misconception, because cyber insurance is such a growing area that every region and every different country and it is moving at a different rate and a different pace. And we try to look at it through a global lens, we're seeing things incorrectly. So we've actually gone back to the drawing board and we're doing new research and looking at, well, what is the state of cyber insurance for North America, for the United States, for Canada? And then later on, how does that compare to Europe? How does that compare to EMEA? How does that compare to Australia, New Zealand? Because they are in such different places. So, I think that's going to be really interesting to see where everyone is at, and then provide guidance for the different regions and different areas that are out there. So I'm really excited about that in the future.
Perfect.
So my guidance would be on the lookout for that.
No, good advice. And so, Jonathan, as you close off, there is a question around CRQ. It's the new buzzword, and they're just asking, do insurance companies leverage open frameworks to calculate it? Maybe that's more for Dan, but maybe you want to touch on that in your closing thoughts on how we keep our rates low and keep secure.
Yeah, I will pass that question to Dan. But what I will say about keeping rates low, as an organization, you have to understand how insurance works. Insurance is based on the pooling of money or premiums of many to pay out for the losses of the few. So even if you do everything you can as an organization in order to protect yourself, have good procedures, policies in place, so on and so forth, you're still going to be impacted by rising or lowering rates of insurance. But what you can do is represent yourselves in the best way possible to ensure that you are the best of the bunch. And I think, to Dan and Christopher's point, you could buy every widget or tool in the world and throw it into your environment, hoping that it makes you look better. But ultimately, it's how you manage that, how you manage risk, and how you address that risk that will determine how you look in the eyes of an insurance company, and therefore determine how far up or down you are from that baseline rate that they apply to their portfolios.
Great advice. Dan, in 10 seconds or less, CRQ.
10 seconds or less. I will say it depends. We have started to look at them, but the old standbys for now, we're really comparing them against that. So to be able to understand what you're doing and how thoughtfully you're applying it, more so than specifically under which framework you're doing so.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I would encourage you to look up our panelists on LinkedIn. That was Dan Elliott from Zurich, Canada. He is prolific on there. Lots of great content he's producing and he's publishing. Jonathan Weeks from Hub International Canada as well. Good thought leader on LinkedIn. So please go check him out, as well as Christopher Fielder from Arctic Wolf and the research that he was talking about. I think that's been posted to the Canadian Cybersecurity Network, but hopefully we can get that out to folk again. Lots of good work happening there. I know that you also have new work that's going to be coming out as well, but we're going to have to hear about that next time because we are out of time. This has just been a fantastic panel. Again, thank you, Dan, Jonathan, and Christopher for just such great, deep advice. And thank you to the Cybersecurity Network, Canadian Cybersecurity Network, and Francois for putting this together, and the Arctic Wolf team behind the scenes making this all work. Thanks to everyone. Very much appreciated. Have a great day. Thanks, everyone.